Some stories terrify us with monsters. Others reveal that monsters were never the real danger. There's a moment in The Witcher 3 that many players still remember as one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire game. Beneath an old tree lies the body of an infant, a child who was never allowed to become part of the world. From those forgotten remains comes a botchling, a creature so grotesque that, at first glance, it's almost impossible to think about anything except the monster itself. But nearly a decade later, I don't think that scene is really about the botchling at all. I think it's about a family that spent years trying to bury its own past, believing that if they could hide it deeply enough, the guilt, the fear, and the consequences of their choices would disappear with it. But that's not how life works. The things we refuse to confront rarely vanish. More often than not, they simply return in a different form. That's why the Bloody Baron quest is still regarded as one of the greatest stories ever told in a video game. Not because it's shocking, not because it presents difficult moral choices, but because beneath the tragedy of one broken family lies something far more familiar than fantasy. Today, I don't want to ask whether the Bloody Baron was a good man or a bad one. That's far too simple a question for the story The Witcher 3 is actually telling. What's far more interesting is why, after all these years, this quest still feels so painfully real. And why, in a world filled with monsters and ancient curses, we end up recognizing not a fairy tale, but ourselves. It's hard to think of a character in The Witcher 3 who makes a worse first impression than the Bloody Baron. Long before the game begins to tell us who he really is, it quietly nudges us toward a very specific conclusion. We learn that he's a heavy drinker. His own men fear him. His wife has fled. His daughter refuses to even hear his name. Then come the stories of violence, drunken rages, and a household where fear stopped being an exception long ago and became part of everyday life. At that point, the verdict seems obvious. He's just another tyrant, another man beyond redemption. And that's precisely when The Witcher 3 begins doing something that very few games have the confidence to do. It doesn't ask us to change our opinion of the Baron. It asks something far more uncomfortable. How much can we really know about another human being based on a first impression? It's an incredibly subtle piece of storytelling, and it's easy to miss during a first playthrough. Most games introduce their characters by inviting us to like them first, only revealing their flaws once we've already formed an emotional connection. The Bloody Baron is written in exactly the opposite way. We're introduced to someone we're almost expected to despise, and only afterward does the game begin to reveal how he became that person. That isn't accidental. The writers want us to judge him. They want us to feel disgust. Because later, the conflict is no longer between us and the Baron. It's between us and our own desire to divide people into heroes and villains. That's why this quest has stayed with players for so many years. It quietly dismantles one of the simplest ways we understand the world, not only in fiction, but in real life. We like to believe that there are good people and bad people. It's a comforting idea. It saves us from asking difficult questions or looking for the reasons behind someone's actions. Reality is rarely that generous. None of this means the Baron is innocent, and that's an important distinction that many discussions about this character tend to blur. Understanding someone is not the same as excusing them. The Bloody Baron abused his wife. He destroyed his own family. The game never hides those facts, nor does it ask us to forget them. Instead, it asks a far more difficult question. If someone is capable of this kind of cruelty, is that where their story ends? Or does the most important part of the story begin the moment we start asking how they became that person in the first place? And it's here that the quest quietly transforms into something much larger than the story of a single man. Because the deeper we follow the fate of the Baron's family, the harder it becomes to believe that Philip Strenger is the true protagonist of this narrative. The real protagonist is trauma. It lingers beneath almost every conversation, every decision, every relationship, and even the monsters we encounter along the way. It moves silently from one person to another, changing faces, changing lives, yet never truly disappearing. Once you begin looking at the story through that lens, something becomes impossible to ignore. The Bloody Baron was never the greatest monster in this quest. He was simply the next person it managed to break. When we first hear Philip Stranger's story, it's tempting to draw a simple conclusion. He spent years at war, he witnessed death, he learned to solve problems with violence. Then he returned home and brought the war back with him. It's a neat explanation. In fact, it's so familiar that we rarely stop to question it. But the truth is far more complicated. War alone doesn't turn someone into an abusive husband. If it did, every soldier who survived history's bloodiest conflicts would come home the same person. We know that's not what happens. Some rebuild their lives. Some retreat into silence. Some spend years trying to outrun nightmares that never truly leave them. Some become devoted parents. Others end up destroying the very people they once loved. So the answer can't simply be war. The real question is what a person does with their pain once it becomes part of who they are. The Baron's story is never handed to us outright. We piece it together from conversations, memories, and quiet confessions, almost like investigators reconstructing a crime scene. And the more carefully we listen, the more one detail begins to stand out. Philip Stranger never learned how to speak about his emotions. He knows how to give orders. He knows how to threaten. He knows how to fight. He knows how to drink. But the moment the conversation turns to guilt, fear, or regret, it's as if he loses the language to express any of it. And that may be one of the most painfully realistic things about his character. Many men of his generation were raised to believe that fear should never be shown, weakness should never be admitted, and pain should be endured in silence. War only reinforces those beliefs. It teaches people how to survive, but it never teaches them how to return to ordinary life. When someone spends years in a world where vulnerability can get you killed, they gradually lose their understanding of what healthy human relationships are even supposed to look like. And that's when something happens that psychologists have observed countless times in the real world. Emotions that can't be expressed through words don't simply disappear. They find another way out. Very often, that outlet becomes anger, or alcohol, or an overwhelming need to control the people around you, not because hurting others brings relief, but because you've forgotten how else to survive your own pain. That's why alcohol plays such an important role in the Baron's story. It would be easy to dismiss him as nothing more than a drunk, but alcohol isn't the source of his violence. It's his escape from it. For a few brief hours, it dulls the guilt, the memories, and the constant tension he's unable to face any other way. The tragedy of addiction, however, is that it never removes the pain. It only postpones the moment you have to face it again. And when that moment comes, the fear is still there. Only now it's joined by something else. Shame. Shame for everything you've done while trying to escape the very thing that drove you to drink in the first place. And little by little, that cycle closes around him until he no longer knows how to break free. There's another subtle decision made by Projekt Red that's easy to overlook. Throughout the entire quest, the Baron almost never tries to excuse what he did. He tries to explain it. Those are two very different things. He never denies hurting Anna. He never pretends nothing happened. Instead, he keeps returning to the past, again and again, as though searching for the exact moment when everything slipped beyond repair. And it's here that we realize we're no longer listening to the story of a villain. We're looking at a man who understood far too late that the war he believed he'd survived had never truly ended. One day, the battlefield simply became his own home, and the people he loved became the ones caught in the crossfire. There's one question that rarely comes up when people talk about the Bloody Baron. By now, we can begin to understand why Philip Stranger became the man he did. That part of the story is no longer the mystery. The more unsettling question is this: what happens to the people who spend years living beside someone who never learned how to live with their own pain? This is the moment when the Baron's story stops being the tragedy of one man. It becomes the tragedy of an entire family. We often imagine domestic abuse as a series of isolated moments. One person loses control, someone gets hurt, an apology follows. Then, eventually, it happens again. But psychologists have pointed out for decades that the deepest damage isn't caused by the violence itself. It's caused by everything that happens in between. Eventually, abuse stops being an event. It becomes the atmosphere people learn to live in. Long before the next outburst ever comes, everyone in the house has already begun to change. They learn to recognize a mood from the sound of footsteps in the hallway, from the way a door closes, from the tone of a single sentence. Their lives become a constant effort to predict the storm before it arrives, and little by little, survival replaces living. That's the Anna we meet. As she speaks about her past, it becomes painfully clear that she didn't just lose faith in her husband. Over the years, she began losing herself. Fear stripped away her ability to see herself as someone whose choices still mattered. She no longer believes she can change her life. She's simply trying to make it through another day. That may be one of the cruelest truths about long-term abuse. It almost never destroys a person all at once. It does so gradually, quietly. It erodes confidence. It teaches people to doubt their own memories, their own emotions, even their own worth. Eventually, the question stops being, "Do I deserve this?" and becomes, "Am I capable of anything else?" But perhaps the most tragic character in this story isn't Anna. It's Tamara, because children are never just bystanders. Even when their parents believe they're only hurting each other, even when they think the child didn't see anything, even when the door was closed. Children rarely remember every word that was spoken, but they almost always remember the feeling of the home they grew up in, and eventually, they mistake that feeling for normal. That's why Tamara doesn't simply run away from her family. She runs away from the idea of family she was raised to believe in. Long before she left the house, it had already stopped feeling like home, and that's when you begin to understand why this quest feels so painfully honest. There isn't a single victim. Everyone loses something. The Baron loses his family. Anna loses herself. Tamara loses both of her parents, even though they're still alive. Each of them suffers differently, but every wound can be traced back to the same source. And that's precisely why Projekt Red placed the botchling at the center of this story. At first, it seems like nothing more than another creature pulled from Slavic folklore, a memorable horror sequence designed to make the quest darker and more unsettling. But look a little closer, and the botchling begins to mean something entirely different. It isn't just a monster. It's a past that was never allowed to be mourned. In Slavic folklore, botchlings were believed to be the restless spirits of children who were denied a proper burial, unable to find peace because their existence had been rejected before they were ever given the chance to live. Projekt Red preserved that legend almost exactly, but by weaving it into the Baron's story, they transform folklore into metaphor. Just like the botchling itself, guilt cannot simply be buried. You can stop talking about it. You can pretend it never happened. You can spend years avoiding the memories. But the past doesn't disappear simply because we refuse to speak its name. It remains, sometimes in memory, sometimes in habits, sometimes in our children. And it's here that the Bloody Baron story stops belonging to one family alone. It becomes something far more universal, a story about how pain that goes unhealed doesn't disappear. It simply becomes part of someone else's inheritance. And maybe that's why this quest is so difficult to forget, because beneath all the monsters, there's almost nothing fictional about it. Everything else we've already seen before. Almost every game teaches us the same reassuring lesson. Make the right decision, persevere through every obstacle, become strong enough, and eventually things will work out. The road may demand sacrifice, but the feeling of victory always seems to be waiting at the end. That is how most stories are built. They encourage us to believe that every problem has a solution, provided we're wise enough to find the right path. The Bloody Baron quest quietly dismantles that belief. When we first arrive at Crow's Perch, we instinctively believe we understand our role in the story. We are Geralt of Rivia, a witcher whose entire profession revolves around walking into places where ordinary people have lost control, confronting whatever monster lurks in the shadows, and leaving the world a little better than he found it. Video games have spent decades teaching us that characters like Geralt exist to change other people's lives. We find the threat, we overcome it, and those caught in its wake finally get the chance to move forward. At first, there is no reason to believe this story will be any different. But as the quest unfolds, another realization slowly begins to take shape. Geralt arrived too late. It is one of the most important ideas in the entire quest, yet the game never feels the need to state it directly. By the time we become involved, nearly everything that truly mattered has already happened. The beatings, the betrayals, the years of fear, the slow collapse of trust, the death of a child, Tamara's decision to leave, Anna's despair. We are never asked to witness a family falling apart. Instead, we arrive after years of damage have already reshaped the lives of everyone inside that house. That is why none of the choices we make can truly restore what has been lost. To me, this remains one of the most honest things any video game has ever expressed. Real life offers no dialogue option capable of erasing years of abuse. There is no single act of redemption powerful enough to make another person forget what they have lived through. Even the most sincere remorse cannot rewrite the past. At best, it can influence the future, and even then, there are no guarantees that it will be enough. That is precisely why the ending of the Bloody Baron quest leaves so many players with such an unusual feeling. It doesn't feel tragic in the way we normally expect tragedy to feel, but neither does it offer the relief of a happy ending. Even if the Baron chooses to fight for Anna, we already understand that this is not a story about a family finding its way back to one another. Too much has already been broken. Too many wounds have had years to deepen. Too much pain has become woven into the lives of every person involved. And that is where the writing reveals its greatest strength. Projekt Red never offers the comforting illusion that one perfect decision can heal a broken life. Instead, the game quietly reminds us that some consequences simply cannot be undone, just as some years can never be lived a second time. The best we can do is decide what we will carry forward from them. There is also a remarkably subtle detail that reinforces this idea without ever drawing attention to itself. After the quest is over, Crow's Perch is still standing exactly where it always was. Its walls remain unchanged, the rooms are still familiar, and nothing about the building itself appears different. Yet the place no longer feels the same. It is as though the house has absorbed everything that happened within it, silently reminding us that some homes stop being homes long before the people inside finally leave them. That is why the conclusion of this quest offers no real sense of victory. What it leaves behind instead is a quiet emptiness, and perhaps that emptiness is exactly what makes it unforgettable. We are so accustomed to stories that resolve every conflict and answer every question that we sometimes forget what great storytelling is capable of. Truly great stories are not always interested in giving us answers. Sometimes, they leave us alone with questions that refuse to disappear once the credits begin to roll. The Bloody Baron story eventually comes to an end. The questions it raises do not. Can a person ever truly atone for the harm they have caused if the consequences continue to live inside someone else? Can anyone genuinely become a different person after the past has already reshaped the people they loved most? And what does forgiveness actually mean if it cannot restore what has already been lost? Perhaps that is why, nearly a decade after The Witcher 3 was released, players rarely remember the battles they fought, the rewards they earned, or even the choices they made. What they remember is the family that no one was ever able to save. There is one reason why the Bloody Baron quest continues to leave such a lasting impression, and surprisingly, it isn't simply because of the writing. Or rather, it isn't only because of the writing. If you were to summarize this quest for someone who had never played The Witcher 3, they would probably hear a story about a war veteran, domestic abuse, and a family falling apart. It would sound like a deeply tragic but ultimately familiar human drama. Stories like these have existed in literature, theater, and cinema for generations. Yet the game accomplishes something that no other medium can achieve in quite the same way. It doesn't ask us to watch this story unfold from a distance. It asks us to live inside it. Throughout the entire quest, we are constantly making decisions, convinced that somewhere ahead there must be a path capable of saving this family. We listen carefully to the Baron, speak with Anna, try to understand Tamara, search for answers, and weigh every choice as though one of them might finally lead us toward the ending we're hoping for. That expectation is built into the language of video games themselves. For decades, games have taught us that persistence is rewarded, that every challenge has a solution, and that if we are thoughtful enough, determined enough, or simply skilled enough, we can eventually make things right. But here, something unusual begins to happen. Little by little, every decision stops feeling like a choice between good and evil. Instead, it becomes a choice between different consequences, none of which can honestly be called happy. The game quietly shifts our expectations without us even realizing it, until we discover that we are no longer searching for the right ending. We're simply trying to leave with the least painful one. That is the moment when The Witcher 3 stops behaving like a conventional role-playing game. Instead of embracing the expectations of the genre, it begins to challenge them. It quietly asks the player to consider an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps not every story exists so that we can fix it. Perhaps some stories exist so that we can understand them. That, more than anything else, is why the Bloody Baron quest is so difficult to forget. Not because it is the darkest story in the game, not because it is the cruelest, but because it forces us to experience something that games rarely allow us to feel: helplessness. Most games treat helplessness as failure. They empower us, reward our determination, and constantly reassure us that every obstacle can be overcome with enough effort. They teach us to believe that every conflict is waiting for a hero capable of solving it. The Bloody Baron quest does the exact opposite. It reminds us that there are moments in life when a person can make every compassionate choice, say every sincere word, and still fail to receive the ending they hoped for. And perhaps that is what makes this story feel so profoundly adult. There is one final detail that quietly brings the entire quest together. When the story is over, life in Velen continues exactly as it always has. Farmers return to their fields. Soldiers remain at their posts. Taverns fill with voices, laughter, and ordinary conversations. The world doesn't pause to acknowledge what has happened. From a technical perspective, that's simply how an open-world game functions. But emotionally, it feels remarkably true to life. Almost every human tragedy unfolds in exactly the same way. For the people living through it, the world feels permanently changed. For everyone else, morning arrives, another day begins, and life moves on. Perhaps that is why the Bloody Baron story continues to feel so real even after all these years. It doesn't end with triumph. It doesn't end with defeat. It simply continues, just as life always does. At the beginning of this video, I told you that beneath an old tree lay the body of an infant. After everything we've explored together, that scene probably feels very different now. Because the botchling was never the most terrifying monster in this story. It was simply the first reminder of what happens when people try to bury their past instead of finding the courage to face it. And perhaps that's why the Bloody Baron quest has stayed with players for so many years. Not because it's shocking, not because it asks us to make difficult choices, and not even because it's a story about domestic abuse. There are countless stories that deal with those subjects. Very few, however, are willing to confront a far more uncomfortable truth. People rarely become monsters overnight. More often, It happens so gradually that they no longer notice the moment when their attempts to protect themselves begin to turn into suffering for everyone around them. But perhaps the most unsettling realization The Witcher 3 leaves us with isn't even that. The real tragedy begins when one person's pain no longer belongs only to them. When it becomes the language a family learns to speak, when children begin to mistake fear for an ordinary part of home, when silence feels safer than honesty, when love slowly gives way to survival, those are the monsters no silver sword was ever meant to defeat. Perhaps that's why Geralt never truly saves the Bloody Baron's family, not because he isn't capable, but because some battles cannot be won by the time we arrive to fight them. They have already been unfolding for years, and perhaps that is one of the most profoundly human ideas at the heart of The Witcher 3. Sometimes heroism isn't found in defeating a monster. Sometimes it begins with refusing to become the next person who passes that pain on to someone else. And if, after finishing this quest, we find ourselves looking a little more carefully not only at fictional characters, but also at the people around us, then perhaps the Bloody Baron has accomplished what all great works of art aspire to do. The greatest stories are rarely remembered because they answer our questions. They're remembered because they change the questions we ask.